to Helen and to Anya there, and a huge thanks to Alicias for your talk earlier. I think we learned so much from it. It was so critical yet so hopeful. Now you're going to hear from myself, Breed Golden, and Vicky Donnelly. So I'm with the DICE project, as I said earlier, and a lecturer here in Mary Immaculate College. And Vicky works with Galway One World Centre, and I'm very lucky to say she also does some part-time lecturing here in Mary I. Today our talk is called Critical Global Learning within Initial Teacher Education. And what we're going to do is share some of the outcomes from my PhD with you today. I was very lucky that I had Vicky as my critical friend during my PhD, who helped me to design and develop and was everything, the truest sense of the words critical and friend, in helping me to develop what I'm going to share with you today. So, where I'm going to start with is to talk to you about where I'm coming from. So I wrote a definition for critical global learning within my PhD, so I'll share that with you so you get a sense of what I'm talking about, and it definitely touches on some of the points that Alicias would have mentioned and builds on some of those as well. So for me, critical global learning is a reflective educational process. So it is a process-based approach. It is not a product-based approach, but it looks at that messiness of that creativeness. It's founded in the values of global justice, equity, and human rights. These are the values that we hold dear in all that we try to do. And it focuses on engaging in understanding and questioning the dominant systems and structures which create and perpetuate multiple forms of inequality globally. So we want to acknowledge the systems and structures that exist in our world that have caused the inequalities that we live with today, and we want to question those dominant narratives. It encourages us to consider how our lives interact with the questions that we explore, and fosters an interest in acting to address inequality. So we don't want to remain in a hopeless state, but we want to look at action and moving forward and creating a better future together. It's a learning process which recognises different ways of understanding the world and consequently draws on multiple perspectives to inform the learning process. So we are interested in looking at different people's approaches, different people's perspectives. This is not Breed Golden education. This is education about looking at what different people have to say about the world and learning from them as well. And Vicky's going to share a little bit of a reflection on Alicia's talk as well to build on those points.
Thanks, Breed. I just to say that I loved Alicia's talk. Alicia's given so much to this community and our collective learning, and has personally nourished my own learning for many years. So I was very inspired by the talk. I thought in particular how she's presenting global education as a direct challenge to the dominant narrative of poverty as being something that is somehow presented to us, largely presented to us as ahistoric and apolitical in that kind of frame, so that it is presented to us as if there's no particular history to how it came about, no particular political forces keeping it in place now. And so we're left with a kind of sense of poverty and inequality as inevitable or natural, that the poor will always be with us and therefore, can never fundamentally be changed. So I really appreciate how she's positioning global education as something that directly challenges that, and that she's challenging us as educators to recognise the implications of going along with that depoliticised, ahistoric framing, that we will end up reinforcing dominant narratives and some really appallingly racist stereotypes. So she's pointing out how global education can help us see beyond some of the more conventional framings, a charity approach, if you like, encapsulated in that very well-intentioned notion of give a man a fish, or the slight upgrade of teaching him to fish. And suggesting that global education equips us maybe with a broader frame and with tools to ask far more penetrating questions about the structural roots of those problems in the first place. So rather than starting with an assumption that the problem is this person's deficit at fishing, to question more perhaps from a gender perspective, as she's saying, an ecological perspective, I would argue a class perspective, but to ask those more fundamental questions about the structures that give rise to a problem like that, like what happened to all the fish in the first place? Is it something to do with trade policies? Is it something to do with super trawlers, in keeping with the fishing analogy? So global education, I think Alicias is really pointing out to us that it does require us to face difficult realities, painful realities and uncomfortable realities, because we have to position ourselves in them as well when that frame is expanded. But it doesn't leave us in that uncomfortable place. I think in the evocation of hope and radical hope, and the possibility of imagination and to reimagine radically different alternatives to the current system and structures, it is a dynamic and hopeful approach that she's painting for us, that allows us to go beyond those limits. Because I think that sense of, I think I'm quoting Irish Aid and also possibly Marx in saying that it's not just our interpretation of the world, the point is to change it. And then just the last thing I suppose that grabbed me was in terms of what's critical about global education, just that other meaning of critical as in urgency, that these are existential issues around the world. We can see that growing inequality, but we can see it amongst the student body here, we can see it in terms of homelessness, we can see it in the lives of children in our classrooms. So the urgency of it, I think, was so powerfully conveyed as well. Thanks to Eilish for that talk.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, we really appreciate the input from Eilish, and a lot of the themes in her talk we build on in our own work as well. So looking at the question of, now that we've established what our understanding is of critical global learning or global education, the next question is, well, why should we be bringing it into initial teacher education? And we're talking about bringing it into all of the aspects of initial teacher education, not just for us whose core work is in teaching global education, but into all the different subject areas and across the breadth of it. So on the one hand, there's a policy agenda, a policy that tells us this is something that we should be doing. So for those of us in initial teacher education, we have the incoming CAME standards that require us to integrate global citizenship education across the board. From internationally, from the Sustainable Development Goals, we have SDG 4, which looks at education and asks us to bring this type of education into our work. In Ireland, we have within our Department of Education, we have education for sustainability strategies, we have intercultural education strategies, and we have ongoing changes to curricula as well. So from our early years right the way up to Leaving Cert, we're seeing changes coming in all the time into our curricula in school, and more often it's bringing in these themes. So the first answer to why should we integrate it into ITE is that policy tells us that we should and that it's necessary. But for me, that's not the important reason at all. The important reason for me as to why we should integrate critical global learning across the whole breadth of ITE, and I notice my spelling mistake on that slide, is that this links to the purpose of education. So for me, this is what education is all about. Education should reflect and respond to society, to the reality of the world that we live in. And we live in an interconnected and an unequal world, as has been so well demonstrated by Alicia's talk and by Vicky's reflections as well. So our responsibilities as educators is to impact the world, to influence society through nurturing and developing responsible, active citizens. So that is why I believe we should be bringing this work in across the board, regardless of what our subject areas are. So why did we do this? So what we're sharing with you today is a conceptual framework that I developed as part of my PhD. After we had done some teaching and we had done lots of reflecting and working together, trying to figure out what the best approach was to teach this subject area, we then developed this framework to support us. So firstly, it ensured that we remained focused on the key learning objectives. It kept our learning objectives to the fore all the time, ensured we didn't stray too far to one end or another, but we kept where we should be. And then it helped us to develop a structured approach to our our teaching and learning. So a structured approach to learning, the literature tells us, is good for students. It's helpful for students in the way that they learn to know what they can expect. But it was also helpful for us as educators to have that structure too. It supported the variety of student experiences within and across groups. So we have students who learn in lots of different ways. And it responds to the challenge of large group and large cohort teaching. So here in Mary Immaculate College, we are fortunate to have lots of wonderful students, but in each year group we will have in excess of 430 students. In each class group that we work with, there can be in excess of 60 students, which is very challenging to do global education work in that context. And so instead of sitting in a corner and having a fit about it or sulking about it, instead we looked at the reality that we work within and looked at how can we develop a structure or a system that helps us to do the best we can within the reality that we are faced with. It also supports us to work collaboratively within the same module with different groups. So we were teaching on the same module, we were teaching the same content, but at separate times with separate groups. So as the coordinator of that work, it helped me to feel relaxed and comfortable, that Vicky was prepared, that she knew what we were trying to, and that the students were getting the same message from both of us. So how did we do it? What did we do?
Well, overall, there were 3 action research cycles. So you see these lovely arrows. These are all Bregis graphics, by the way. They just get better and better as they're coming, so I can't claim any credit for them. So we have these 3 cycles, the green arrows there, a cycle per year. But you'll also notice how she's included a much more meandering kind of organic blue line, which represents the actual cycles that also happened within each of those. So that even within a week or even within a day, actually, that these cycles could recur, that we would, we'd plan, we'd deliver, we'd come together, we'd reflect, we'd adjust, we'd teach again, and so on and so on. So that was, yes, the reality, I suppose, of it.
Yeah. So with that messy reality that we were both really enjoyed, organic, sorry, not messy, that we really enjoyed and loved being involved in together, what came out of it was this. So it's a 2-part conceptual framework for integrating critical global learning into your teaching, regardless of the subject area that you're working within. So yes, we designed it in response to our modules which focus specifically on critical global learning. But I would argue and hope that these models can be used across the board regardless of your subject area and can be applied to lots of different areas. And my dearest hope in life is that these models and this planning tool, they get torn apart and they get taken to pieces, and bits get added in and bits get taken out, and people draw all over them and make them useful and apply them to different settings. So I'm going to take you through them and talk you through the different elements of both of them. And as I do so, I'd ask you to consider your own work. So regardless of what your work is, to try and see, does any of this connect with what you're doing? And does any of it resonate with you? So I'm going to start with the model for teaching critical global learning, which when I look at it like this, always looks like some sort of underwater animal, I always think. But for right now, I want you to focus on that center orange circle. So that center orange circle says a commitment to criticality. So all of the work that comes around that centers on this commitment to criticality. And actually, none of the rest of it really flows if we don't have that commitment. But the interesting thing is that in order to develop that commitment, we need the rest of it to be happening as well. So it's an organic, interconnected system. So I'm going to start with the left-hand arc, the blue arc, which looks at the considerations for teaching. So as teachers, what do we need to be conscious of, aware of, thinking about when planning for our own teaching? So the first thing is external influences. So acknowledging that our students do not come to us as blank slates, that our students come to us from lots of different places with lots of different influences. So first of all, they have individual and personal influences, often family or personal experiences that influence who they are and where they're coming from. And secondly, we all have societal and cultural influences that influence the thoughts that we have, the perceptions that we might bring with us. And it's really important for us as educators to be conscious of that and to make an effort in so far as possible to get to know the influences on our students' lives, to better understand where they're coming from and acknowledge that for them. Secondly, it was important to identify the important pedagogy, the pedagogical approaches that we're going to support and underpin our approach to critical global learning. So firstly is an active and participatory approach. And this was a journey for me. I always on paper, believed and professed to be committed to active and participatory learning, but at the start of my career I did an awful lot of chalk and talk, believing I had all the important knowledge and I needed to give it to others, and once I gave it to them, then we would get on to the discussions. But of course that wasn't how it worked. So pulling back on the content and providing lots of opportunities for discussion and interaction actually meant that they learned more, and they learned more in depth as well. Second is a dialogical approach, so between students and us, and between students between each other, that it became a classroom environment that had a lot of dialogue in it. And lastly is a pedagogy of discomfort, so a term coined by Megan Bowler. A pedagogy of discomfort is the approach that we take to things, in that we say it's actually okay to be uncomfortable. We're actually asking you to get uncomfortable in this, and we would say that it's the least we can ask for is for you to be uncomfortable when we're talking about such critical and such important issues. So that's where we lead in from, that we get into that messy space. Next is the conditions for learning, and there was huge learning for this in me. It was things that I knew in theory and had learned through my B.Ed, my M.Ed, prior to coming into my PhD, things I knew to be true, but when I saw them working in practice, it was a whole other thing. So through the conditions for learning, we focused on relationships, values, and the learning environment. So through focusing on relationships, to even simple things like saying hello and welcome at the start of a lecture, saying thank you and goodbye at the end, finding ways to say students' names in every lecture and to use their names. Even though we had loads of students, we found approaches and ways that we could use their names in every class. In the learning environment, we had strict rules about them sitting in group no more than 4. To a group, so that things didn't get too out of hand. We had a routine, a structure. They knew what to expect when they would come in. We would begin every session with a reflection to ground us in what we were doing, and we had lots of wonderful displays. And then for values, we focused on values through the relationships that we built with them, using explicit values-based language, and then being vulnerable and sharing our values with them as well, so that they could see what that was like. The conditions for learning that we created, probably one of the most important things that we did, because by creating and working on the right environment for learning, so much more came out of that they were so much more willing to buy in and be part of the learning. And then lastly on this arc is the outcomes. So in terms of outcomes, what we're talking about is a dual approach to outcomes, or dual awareness. So one is personal outcomes for them as individuals, as human beings, and secondly is societal outcomes. So we're talking about working with in initial teacher education. These are future primary school teachers, and we were really conscious of the outcomes for society as a result of this work with them. Okay, so moving on to the other arc, my second arc, looks at the skills. So I tried to figure out, well, what did we need to look for? So to know that I had success and know that things were working, I first needed to know, what did I need to look for? What does success look like? So I identified 4 key skills and some sub-skills that were the key things that should be coming out. So the first one is developing and using a global learning knowledge base. So they need to know things in order to be critical about them. So they need to know that knowledge is fluid and contested and changes. They need to understand power relations within global education development contexts, and they need to make connections within and between different topics that they learn about. Secondly, they need the skill to question orthodoxies. So to be able to identify orthodoxies, or we can replace orthodoxies with stereotypes or with status quo stories. So they need to identify them and know that they exist, which can be harder than you might think. Then to start to deconstruct them and break them down and question them. And then lastly, to envisage new stories. So we don't stay, as I said earlier, in that place of despair or hopelessness, but that we look for what can we change, what can we do differently. Then we move on to the skill of self-reflection. So considering personal perceptions of the world and others, what do we know to be true? What are our opinions? And very often we would find that students hadn't really spent time thinking about what their opinions were. So having that space and time to consider that. And then secondly, committing to challenging and changing those opinions based on things that we hear and things that we learn. Lastly, the last skill is to use a values lens. So this looks at considering multiple perspectives, learning about different perspectives on the world, and then identifying contradictions between our values and our actions. So all of us have contradictions. It is part of being human and living in the world, but the important part is being able to recognize those contradictions and finding ways to move forward. So I profess to be committed to sustainability and tackling climate change, and yet a couple of weeks ago I booked flights to go to Portugal. So there's a contradiction there in what I'm saying and then the actions that I carry out. And I need to, for me, to recognize that, and that's a skill we look for in students. So we have the model that looks at everything that we need to look for and be aware of, and then we created the planning tool. So the planning tool tells us what should we do in the classroom. So there's a funnel around the center, and that funnel is the conditions for learning that we already talked about: relationships, values, and environment. And then going into the funnel, we have 4 lesson elements, and those are the 4 blue balls. So firstly is challenging content, so having challenging knowledge, challenging information, learning to unlearn those stereotypes through both indirect and direct teaching. Secondly, we looked at individual work through personalising issues for students and asking them to consider their own perspectives. Next was group work. So because we had them sitting in groups of 4, we could do group work in every single session. And what we were doing through that was trying to honour all voices in the classroom. So everyone had an opportunity in every single class to talk and give their opinion, even if only at their small group. And lastly, we had a collective responsibility to contribute to whole class work. So everyone was expected to contribute in some way, verbal or non-verbal, to the whole class work as well. So coming out of the funnel at the bottom, we are conscious of 3 different types of outcomes. So we have personal outcomes as individuals, professional outcomes as teachers, and the one that they focus on the most is the module assessment. And the module assessment is the one we see. We don't see the other 2. We're just conscious of them into the future. So, looking at our experiences of implementing the framework, where we came from, the key learning and key successes for us. So, just quite quickly, some of the key learning for me was that students need the opportunity to do this. They told me repeatedly, they told us all the time that they needed the chance to practice criticality before they could do it themselves. They needed to build up that skill. We know that students learn in different ways and at different rates. And for us, a structured approach was so helpful because it supported me in attending to the complexity and the breadth of global learning, that I could hold something so complex and be confident that I was delivering it with the tools I'd created. And then acknowledging that teaching critical global learning, it requires hard work and effort. A structured approach is not enough. We have to put in that work ourselves as well. So then, for Vicky, some key learning.
Thanks, Rich. I learned an enormous amount, so I just picked out 4, and I learned an enormous amount from Breach in this whole experience. But amongst them, and I know Breach has said this already, but I think it has to be acknowledged that the very structures and systems that are at play that we're looking at in global education also create very challenging conditions in the classroom. You know, there's very large numbers. And that this framework really had huge value in terms of trying to just pragmatically make the absolute most of those opportunities. And I've seen how that has been applied in my other work as well, where you get parachuted into a school for 40 minutes with the TYs or whatever. It's been enormously helpful. That criticality, apart from that willingness to be uncomfortable, which is a very low bar, it also calls for courage on our part and on the students' part to take risk and to explore things from unfamiliar angles, to be part of creating knowledge with the group, so that they're bringing in their own experiences and those vulnerabilities, but that those insights, those critical, you know, those moments, those aha experiences are wonderful, but they're not necessarily permanent. That those dominant narratives are really sticky, to use the technical term, that we get drawn back, I suppose, into the orthodoxies, and because they are systems of power, and our position in those systems might make it more convenient to forget those insights, or might make it uncomfortable to remain with them. So the framework also had value in just building that muscle, I suppose, and building the habit of criticality, and to return to those uncomfortable places. We had a long, ongoing conversation about the importance of personalising issues, that's the point of connection, but that if we stay there, if we just remain in the personal without that political aspect going alongside it, does it somehow end up reinforcing those dominant narratives, the kind of neoliberal kind of love of individualism. So yes, I know we're short on time, so we'll continue that one another time.
we continue that conversation on an ongoing basis. Thanks, Vicky. We're just going to share some evidence of success from the students themselves, so some of the data from them. So they demonstrated criticality in their classwork with us. So on this slide here, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, this was individual work on individual small whiteboards. Above that, we have group tasks of them doing ranking activities. And on the left-hand side is capturing some of that whole class work. So on the top, where they would have contributed post-it notes that created a collective whole, and on the bottom, where we would have had class discussions going through different topics together. They also demonstrated criticality through their assessments, and in their assessments they were asked to create definitions, to think through what their understanding was of different issues, but also to do what we called concept maps and create connections between different topics. So you can see in the two photographs here, some people made fewer connections and wrote a lot, and some people made a lot of connections with fewer words. And it was really important to acknowledge that for each of those students, that's a step forward and that's an extra step. So it's not that one is better than the other, but that each student is learning in and of themselves. And then from focus group interviews that we did with them, the things that they said to us. So the first one saying, I think we get to do so much interactive and group work, and it's not all just there, put your hand up with an answer. You feel like a lot of people are given opportunity. If they didn't want to talk in front of the whole class, they still have an opportunity to get their opinion across. The different methodologies has already made it open for a lot of different learners and styles. So this for me really reinforced the importance of those 4 lesson elements in the planning tool, that they had a chance to work individually, in groups, and then at the whole class level. So if they weren't comfortable talking in front of the whole class, they always had an opportunity to talk at different levels and in different ways, and this was really helpful to them. The quote in the middle, criticality happens every week because there are always debates at the table and things to talk about and think differently about. And if you keep doing it, you get more comfortable with it. So they were telling us they needed to practice it, and that the more they practiced it, the better it got. So they would often start the semester feeling uncomfortable, not our biggest fans, not the biggest fans of the subject area, but that as time went on and they would try it out and try things out, things got a little bit better and a little bit easier for them. I'm going to skip over this next section so we can share some of the learning from earlier workshops that we did in person today with some of the staff in Mary I. So just acknowledging that there were tensions that arose. So some examples from workshops earlier today. Vicky's going to share a little bit of the learning from it, and I'll join in as well.
Yeah, just very briefly, and I cannot read the tiny writing now, so just from memory, there was certainly an agreement that there was enormous overlap, whether in themes or approaches. There was a sense of global education as something that that could easily be integrated, or well, I don't know about easily, but certainly could readily be integrated across a whole range of subjects, and that there was also a sense of excitement and appetite for that it would actually bring practice alive for people as well. There was a really important mention, I think, from a teacher who described herself as coming from a migrant background, and what that also brought to the classroom, what that added in terms of students being able to see themselves sometimes reflected in her identity, or to pose difficult questions to her, and the space that she opened to do that. So I suppose, given the theme of yesterday's session, I think yesterday's, and to reflect on that, the lack of diversity even in this room, that just the value that comes from that was also a really powerful point that came out today.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the key things that we established when we could have conversations with people, because we were in the room together, was that no one's starting from zero, that everybody is starting from somewhere and bringing really valuable insights and ideas, and it's about building on those and looking at where this applies to their own work. So to conclude our talk, our message that we want to leave you with is an invitation. So we want to leave you with an invitation to consider how what we've talked about today can apply to your own work, whether it be the nuanced bits of the frameworks and the exact wordings of what we used, or other approaches and general concepts or ideas that you think could be integrated into your own work. We hope that some of it is helpful and useful for you.